Y'all, welcome back to the Healthy Sex Podcast. We are recording episode 23 today with the incredible Mr. Jay Stringer. Jay, it is such an amazing honor to have you on the show today. Thank you so much for being here.
Chris, thank you so much for having me. It's such a delight to be here.
Yes, it's I'm trying not to fangirl as a fellow therapist. That's what I told my camera people. In our world, it's easy to kind of get very acquainted with specifics and who does what in our field, but I'm finding, the outside world is still very unacquainted. So I'm just incredibly excited to continue to spread the message that you've been blessed to spread to my audience today and kind of continue to help promote, your teachings and what you're up to with your ministry right now.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so Jay, I'd love if you could tell the audience a little bit about yourself. I know that you are an ordained minister. You're a licensed mental health counselor.
Yes.
Yes, author, coach. You train other therapists and ministers, correct?
I do.
Okay. All right. So I'd love to, if you don't mind, can you tell a little bit about yourself, how you got into this field? How did the Lord lead you to this place?
I'd love to.
Okay.
So I grew up, I'm a PK, a pastor's kid. So I grew up in a Presbyterian household. And so, I always say like that my middle school self would be horrified to be having this conversation with you today, Carissa.
Okay.
So went through puberty while attending a Southern Baptist high school, which is just one of those experiences that I would not recommend to anyone. So
God
kind of
bless
like,
you.
A more stoic Presbyterian background, but also kind of more of a fundamentalist Southern Baptist culture.
Okay.
And just that's where I got a front row seat to just a lot of really bad metaphors with regard to sex. Like sex was, just one of those things that you wanted to delay, you wanted to not talk about it. So I can remember we had speakers that would come through from Liberty University every so often, and they were kind of cutting their teeth getting into ministry.
Sure.
And I remember this one guy, just gave this metaphor of basically a wolf that basically the Inuit people, when they were trying to kind of protect their camp from an outside danger, would put like a dagger with seal's blood on it outside the camp.
Oh
and
my
then
gosh.
the wolf would apparently come in and start licking the seal's blood. And what it couldn't discern halfway through the licking was that I can't even believe I'm saying this, but the wolf wouldn't be able to discern what was seal's blood and then what was its own blood. And then in the morning would be like a dead wolf. And no lie, the young up and coming minister was like, there's a lot of you boys, a lot of you middle schoolers and high schoolers that are masturbating. And I'm telling you, it feels good in the morning, or it feels good in the evening, but it's going to make you spiritually dead in the morning. And I just remember being like a senior in high school at chapel, kind of senior sat in the front, and I turned my head. And I just saw so many horrified, classmates.
Yes.
And that was kind of like, what on earth? I even knew, at 17 or so, like, this is not healthy. This just consigns so many people to shame, really bad metaphors. And so that was kind of like, growing up in a family that didn't really talk about sex, and then just growing up in purity culture. And then you kind of get into marriage and get into seminary. And thankfully the seminary and grad school that I went to placed a really big emphasis, and they would say that, you can't take anyone further than you have been yourself.
Amen.
And so that was just such an invitation to me to address my story, to address my family of origin, my relationship to my parents, my own relationship to sex. And just kind of realized that I had so much just internalized shame, a lot of judgment, a lot of condemnation as it came to my own sexuality, as it came to my own arousal.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the process that I started getting into some of this work. Was there is just so much that I don't understand about this realm. And thankfully had a really good therapist, good facilitators as part of my grad school that really began to ask questions far more than just kind of making blanket statements.
Okay.
And that allowed me to explore some of my story. And then, part of the church that I was a part of in the North Seattle area, they were doing a lot of work in an area of North Seattle that had a lot of unhoused neighbors and prostitution.
Okay.
And so we got invited by the mayor's office of Seattle to talk to basically a John school that they had started in 2009.
Okay.
And that's basically a school for men who have been arrested for soliciting prostitution. So I got in just to talk about the neighborhood impact of what it was like to see Johns drive around our neighborhood and kind of what that impact was.
Okay.
And eventually, through some of those networks and conversations, eventually became the sex therapist for the city of Seattle. And that's really where
Wow.
I started getting just a lot of pattern recognition of, working with a lot of men who are buying sex and just started seeing a lot of patterns emerge with these men. So I remember one of the first men that I worked with clinically, he told me, Jay, don't get me wrong. I love buying sex. I love the pleasure that comes from it. But what I am after more than anything is I love cruising around the neighborhood in my SUV and just trying to make eye contact with women in prostitution or just other women on the street. And so as we began to work that story back, one of the stories that he told was he was a latchkey kid, and in middle school he got a Schwinn bicycle, and he remembers riding his bike around the neighborhood, and that was kind of always his favorite part, is he would lock eyes with a friend's mom or a friend, and they might invite him over for dinner or for a barbecue. And so that's part of what we began to bridge for him is, in his disengagement, in some of the abandonment of his childhood, he began a cruising strategy. And that strategy eventually became very unhealthy, far more entitled. But for him, he had never connected the dots between those stories. So,
Wow.
No, that's a longer intro, but purity culture, pastor's kid, and then some just clinical pattern recognition with regard to, how do people end up in self-sabotage behaviors, and just learned a lot that eventually led to doing some substantial research in the field around these topics. But I guess what I can tell you is I come from a lot of shame culture, but I'm just a very curious guy with regard to why do people do what they do? And I don't really accept many conventional answers, whether that comes from the church or whether that comes from the mainstream world. I think that there's far more going on than most of the sound bites that we hear in mainstream or Christian cultures.
Well, I think in reading your book and listening to some of your other teachings that people have engaged with you as far as on social media and podcasts, to me, and I mean this as a high compliment, you have a John Eldridge flair as far as you are a nonconformist in your thinking. You seem deeply intuitive. You have a healthy masculine that's also very tender and gentle. And it seems like you are poetic and you have a deep understanding of grace. So just as a fellow human, Christian, therapist, who is also acquainted with shame culture, I think those parts of who you are seem to be very healing for an audience, and that to me is just a really powerful, beautiful place. I know that comes across in your literature in the book Unwanted, so I'm going to share this because a lot of people still don't know about this masterpiece and work of art. So I have been telling people, I refer this to a lot of clients often, you need to read this book because you have such a grace-oriented, deeply theologically sound understanding of God's love for us and the gospel. And it's just been really beautiful and inspiring to listen to how you engage sexuality from that perspective instead of how the majority of believers have engaged sexuality over the generations. Does that make sense?
It does. And thank you, Carissa.
Yeah.
That is so incredibly kind, and receive your words, and also know to be able to recognize those things also means that you possess those qualities as well. So
well,
honored to
thank you. Yeah. Well, yes.
be in this conversation.
Well, I'm honored to have you. So like I said, and I'll share with the audience because this is on Apple, Spotify, and not everything's going to be video. To the audience, I mentioned I'm trying not to fangirl. So selfishly, I know you do a lot of trainings with professionals. So when I was praying through the conversation I want to have with you, I think my heart is I want to, it's common language for you and I because we've done the work and the training, and this is our area. But to an outsider, it's still very it's still very uncommon or unfamiliar to kind of integrate grace and theology and the gospel with unwanted sexual behavior. So I would love to talk through just kind of stuff that's going to be real simple for you because you can do it in your sleep, I'm sure, at this point. But I'd love to talk through it just to kind of bless those who are listening with a different concept of how to.
Let's go.
Is that cool? Okay. So your book, Unwanted, you talk about unwanted sexual behavior. And when we were dialoguing about this, you said, should we come at it from a secular or a faith base? And I think the faith base would be really meaningful because my work down here in the South and all over different parts of the U.S., the church is still struggling to figure out how to navigate this better. So I'd love to, can you first start we're going to come at it from a faith perspective as far as the moral compass of this conversation. Can you start, Jay, by kind of addressing what are unwanted sexual behaviors? Like what would constitute unwanted sexual behaviors?
Sure. So I started using the phrase unwanted sexual behavior because whenever I would hear this conversation, especially in the Christian world, almost any sexual behavior that was, sinful outside of marriage was kind of just referred to as a sex addiction.
Right.
And, while I believe that sex addictions do exist, I think it's completely overdiagnosed. And when you just move in to pathologize someone without understanding what are the stories that are embedded within those behaviors, you just put people into a lot of hiding, a lot of denial, and just a lot of resistance to accept this. So what I learned from a lot of my clients would be that they would come in and say, hey, I don't really identify with the sex addiction language, but I do know that there's this thing that I keep doing that I don't want to be doing. It is an unwanted dimension of my life. And then in the kind of mainstream circles, you might kind of have, something like porn, infidelity that are just kind of, maybe it's not quite healthy, but these are normal behaviors. And so we don't want to shame and stigmatize people because what we know from psychology is that the more shame that someone is experiencing, the more behaviors that they're going to seek out that reinforce that shame.
Right.
So the mainstream world, don't have a ton of resistance in that realm of let's mitigate some of the shame within this. But then with the Christian conversation, how do we kind of work with people who, have probably never understood that sex can be healthy and that there are portions of sex education that they have profoundly missed growing up.
Right.
And so that was kind of the invitation is what if we could help people to understand their sexual story? So in psychology, some people will talk about nature, nurture, and neighborhood. And so part of what I have found in my clinical work and in my research is that the nurture that we grow up with or the love that we receive that we don't receive is going to have a bearing on our attachment and therefore how we relate to sex. One of the things that I learned from a sex therapist way too late in the game was that she kind of compared a 13-year-old boy, I think she said something has 200 parts per million testosterone in her system. You can correct me if I'm wrong.
Okay.
But then by the time you get to the age of 15, that goes up to 1,400 parts. So she kind of compared it to a shot glass to a pint glass or going from a Strider balance bike to a motorcycle.
Right.
And if the only framework that you have is that you should not be sexual and you need to kind of don't awaken love and you need to suppress these things, that is crazy making for a 13, 14-year-old boy. Yep. And so when I was at the Southern Baptist High School, one of the things that I started realizing is that right around the age of 14 or 15, a lot of boys began to raise their hands with these unspoken prayer requests. And the unspoken prayer requests, as we would learn later in these discipleship groups, was almost always sexual fantasy, masturbation, porn related.
Sure.
And so that to me is just freaking maddening of how are you going to kind of talk about the beauty and glory of sex, and then do not give children and adolescents any language to understand their bodies, and then expect some type of masterpiece. So the point that I make in Unwanted is, imagine going to culinary school and the only training you get is how to not get salmonella, and then they expect you to learn how to cook. It's madness.
That's a beautiful metaphor. Yeah.
Just that notion of, the nurture that we have growing up affects us, the nature of the way that God has designed our bodies, but then the neighborhood. What are the experiences that we have with peers, from abuse that we might experience in our neighborhood to, just porn culture and just other dimensions that we experience. So if we're really going to have a healthy and holistic understanding of sex, we need to implement all three of those into our understanding. And often what happens in the Christian world is that, there's a lot of language that the lust of the eyes, the flesh,
right.
We need to kind of combat those things. The heart is deceitfully wicked.
Right.
And so essentially what they emphasize is that, by nature, we are very deeply sinful people. And once you begin in kind of Genesis 3 without understanding Genesis 1 and 2,
right,
you're off to a really, really bad start. And so that's part of what I'm trying to kind of disrupt is, instead of just pathologizing sex, let's work with this notion that people have these unwanted dimensions of their life. And I believe that the gospel, if we're really understanding it, needs to go deeply into these places of heartache and angst. And so I want people to see that their sexuality and even their sexual failure is not a barrier to their spiritual formation. It's one of the most essential ingredients for it. And so I think that's the invitation that I want to have to a lot of Christian communities is, we are missing a very vital dimension of discipleship just through shaming people into, just consigning them that you're immoral, you're just full of lust. And then that sets up a lot of lust management, that sets up a lot of suppression. And so we have to disrupt that narrative.
Okay, and we could do 3 podcasts just from that. So,
right?
Yes.
Yes.
So, okay, Jay, I want to. Are you writing a new book about desire?
I am.
You
Yes.
are. So, I would love to, at some point in this conversation, talk about desire and eros a little bit, because I think that you just shared something recently about blaming lust is lazy and unbiblical. Do I remember that correctly?
It is.
I love that. So I don't know if you want to naturally segue into that, because part of what I would love to hear you talk about is how you do a fantasy assessment, and in your book you encourage people to listen to their lusts, which is completely counterintuitive to the Christian community. So I'd love to bravely go there in the conversation if you're okay with that.
Love it. Yep. So a lot of what I would say is the primary Christian approach to dealing with unwanted sexual behaviors, which I would define as use of pornography, infidelity, or really any dimension of your sexual life that you just feel is unwanted. That could be a fantasy. Sometimes people will come to me to say I can't achieve an orgasm with my spouse without going to this particular image or this particular fantasy. And so therefore it's an unwanted dimension of their life.
Okay.
And so most of the way that people try to address that, I would say, is through lust management. And what lust management is you slap a rubber band around your wrist when you're having a sexual thought. You get internet monitoring put on your computer.
Sure.
You get into accountability groups. If you really can't stop it, you try to pray that the Spirit of God would kind of take this desire away from you.
Right.
Kind of make a lot of references to this is just the thorn in my flesh.
Yes.
Really doesn't matter. It's all that sense of I need to manage this thing. And again, I think we have that all wrong. Okay. So part of where I would begin theologically is, just Romans 12:2 that says, do not be conformed to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. And so I think Christianity is really trying to get the first part of that right, which is we don't want to be conformed to some of the unhealthy patterns and normalcy of this world.
Right.
So check. We're getting that right.
Right.
But be transformed by the, renewing of your mind. Well, what does that mean? It's a change of consciousness. And you can't transform your sexual mind if you don't understand what are the stories, what are the fantasies that are going on inside there. Mm-hmm. So part of what we have to grapple with is, because God is omniscient and knows all, God is not surprised nor ashamed of what we are experiencing in our sexual mind and our fantasy life. So, therefore, we need to understand that we need to renew our sexual mind, but you can't renew something that you don't have any language to name. And so I remember back before he passed away, there was a guy named Dr. Mark Laser, who I was attending a conference or a webinar or workshop, and one of the things he said is that sexual fantasies are nothing to be ashamed of. They are, in fact, our greatest teachers.
Amen.
And I just remember being like, I love that thought, because I've been processing life around that line, and there is meaning within these behaviors. So I'll pause there and then go to, there's this guy named Lacan, who is a French psychoanalyst.
Okay.
And one of the things that he would say is every patient, every client has a symptom. And so in French, the word symptom is symptôme. And he said that every symptom is actually a symptôme. And symptôme in French is the word for holy man, or the phrase for holy man. So for Lacan, every symptom of a client's life, every backache, every unwanted fantasy, every place of depression or anxiety, those are symptoms. Those are our body's way of trying to tell the truth that cannot be acknowledged by the patient. And so when I was kind of bridging kind of Romans 12:2, Laser's thought, and Lacan's thought, that's kind of like where kind of the matrix began to come clear, where it's like there is so much meaning in our fantasy life, but we are taught to run away from it.
Right.
And again, I think that there is a time to run away, but there's also a time to get really curious. So in the Old Testament, whenever the angel of the Lord appears to people, like, to Hagar, the question is, where do you come from and where are you going? When God finds Adam after he has just eaten of the fruit that God had commanded him not to eat from, God says, basically, where are you?
Right.
Jacob, same thing. He's been struggling his whole life with identity and what is his name, and the angel of the Lord says, what is your name? And he can't get it right. And so that sense of like, when God comes to find us, God and the Spirit often arrive with questions far more than accusations. So that was kind of, for me, the invitation to say, what can we learn about sexual fantasies? What can we learn about porn searches? And so that led to some original research where I didn't just want to know, like, does someone look at porn or have an affair?
Right.
I wanted to know the specifics of what they're actually looking at in Pornhub. Like, what do they actually Google?
Right.
What types of affair partners do they pursue? And so that was kind of some of the research that we did was, can we begin to predict human behavior? And can we begin to predict why someone would go to one genre of porn and not the other based on their story? And, we can unpack that as we go, but part of the thesis that, or the findings that we found out of that were that, unwanted sexual behaviors are not random. And so the point that I'm always trying to make is that your unwanted sexual behavior can actually be a roadmap to healing, not this life sentence to shame and addiction, because embedded within the behavior that people are trying to escape from are actually clues to the healing and growth that they need in order to kind of live with a healthy understanding of their sexuality.
Beautifully said. Yes, I think that is so revolutionary for everybody. When in your book, when you talk about the vicious cycle of what gets people into the unwanted sexual behavior, you talk about the 6 core life experiences, and then some stuff about men who fantasize about power over women. There were high levels of shame, lack of purpose, and having a strict father. I think, as you were saying earlier, how we are raised totally conceptualizes who we believe God the Father is. So for you to be able to see that God is coming to find us and wants to move toward us when we're in that place would be completely counterintuitive for people who have had these experiences. Right?
Exactly.
So
Yes.
I would imagine in your work, as you're inviting people into that conversation of their story, it probably shapes. They probably get to the root of how they see God, right? Like if I think my dad is punitive or shaming and really strict and controlling, then I definitely can't. And then I transpose that onto who God is. It's going to be hard for me to go to God with my fantasy or my sexual brokenness because he's just like dad, right? That's a lot of what I see in my work. And honestly, what I've experienced in my own spirituality. So I'm just, there's just so much, it just all innervates, and I'm trying to like bring it all in for conversation sake.
Yeah, I mean, let's unpack that one just for a second, because that's a pretty common sexual fantasy. Is like you might be, in this case, a man. We can unpack kind of fantasies for women as well, but like in this particular fantasy, that was one of the most common fantasies, was that you had this man that would seek out college or teen porn, or maybe a race that suggested to the user some level of subservience, or someone with a more petite body type. And so we said, okay, if that's your search, what could we learn about your backstory? And as you just kind of put it, we learned that porn user had a very strict father. He had a high lack of purpose in his life and deep shame. So if you're growing up in a very rigid home, one of the things that we need to recognize is that when you have authority that's creating systems of rigidity, that's going to lead you to feel very powerless. And not just powerless, you're likely going to be humiliated through that father's look, through his whipping of you, through his, you have to go pick out a switch to be able to have him hit it with you. Some level of powerlessness and humiliation comes in that type of family. So then much later in life, what are you going to desire? Well, you're going to desire the reversal of those experiences. So one of the reasons why porn is so appealing is that it's not just a lust issue. It actually reverses powerlessness. And so if you come from that family of origin where, you had no voice, you were constantly nitpicked, and you felt powerless to kind of change anything, porn is going to be deeply appealing because it's about power at the end of the day. I can search for what I want, I can see what I want, and I can have unlimited power. So you can be, Clark Kent in your normal life, but then by the time you end a porn session, you feel like you're Superman in terms of what you are able to achieve. And so that is that invitation of those things are not disconnected. And so if you grow up and you feel a lot of shame about that behavior, that is where a lot of the projection comes that God must be ashamed of me as well, because very similar to the father that I grew up in. And so that's where I'm trying to say that like God is deeply curious about the human heart. God is deeply kind. And that's, Romans 2:4, do you not know that it is the kindness of God that leads to repentance or change, which is that same kind of change of consciousness. And so if we're really understanding and listening to the voice of God, in my estimation, is not full of accusation and condemnation. It's full of curiosity that's really inviting us to reflect on how we got to where we are today.
And I'll be honest, Jay, even listening as a therapist who's been doing this for 14 years, it's still kind of, I'm like, is that true? Could that be true? Because of my own experience with my family of origin. I mean, it was highly shame-based and generations of addicts and people who were unwell. So that shame culture and like punitive and rigid. So even as somebody who's been in the industry for a while or in this ministry, I'm like, really? Is God that curious? Because I'm pretty sure I'm not performing well enough for him to want to pay attention to me. Do you know what I'm saying? So that's what, when I say, like when people come in for sex therapy, part of my informed consent often is sex therapy will rarely be just about sex. And that's what you're sharing with the audience is sex leads us back to trauma. It leads us back to healing for family dynamics. It leads us back to spiritual formation and theology and spiritual healing. Like sex is really a roadmap into deep healing of all parts of us. Is that essentially what you're...
So well said.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think that that's part of it. Part of the ideas that I'm trying to explore in the next book are just around, erotic energy and sex, that I think that sex is full of revelation.
Yes.
It's full of provocation, and then eventually full of healing.
Yes.
But the problem is that we don't like things about us being revealed about sex. And so it could be our anxiety.
Right. Yeah.
It could be our, sexual hiddenness or behaviors. And so I think part of the point of sex is to reveal all this stuff about my window of tolerance, about my anxiety, about my entitlement. So in marriage, sex is amazing and beautiful, but it's freaking maddening as well, because it reveals so much about who I am and my limitations and areas that I don't know how to understand my wife and just like want to shut down.
Sure.
And so that revelation is really meant to provoke me into change. It's meant to provoke me into healing of what are the wounds, what are the things that I need to pay attention to.
Right.
But also what we don't talk nearly enough, especially in the church, and I would say mainstream world, is how do I develop a self that is differentiated, that can kind of hold on to myself, to understand who I am, to grow, to hold on to who I am in the presence of someone else. And that's so difficult.
Oh my goodness.
To have those things provoked. But if sex is eventually going to be healing and transformative, I have to honor the revelation, the provocation, and the healing. But I know this from my own life and my clients' life, is we say we want healing and growth, but we hate revelation, and we don't like being provoked past our window of tolerance.
We sure don't. There are very few people that when you finally get to the core trauma stuff, they're like, yep, let's keep going. Like that's when they think they're ready to go. And then when you get there, it's like, bye, just kidding. Thought I wanted to heal, but didn't realize it was going to take me here. Yeah.
Totally. Or just being able to be honest and say, I had a very that sex has been so mediocre and boring. And what is that revealing? And what is that trying to provoke within me?
Yeah.
And most couples don't really engage those conversations because it could be an ego strength issue. It could be any number of just, we don't tend to have these conversations about sex. And so, a lot of clinicians in your world will talk about, I hear this metaphor a lot, that we need to be able to talk about sex as fluently and as easily as we talk about what we want to have for dinner.
Exactly.
And so that sense of creating a menu of what do I enjoy? What do I, we've been having a lot of root vegetables lately, and I don't want them tonight.
No.
So, but we can't talk about that very often within sex. So then it just goes into a hidden place. It goes to a shutdown place. And I think when you don't have language and you can't talk through these things in relationship, that's really where shame and pathology and just boredom really begin to set in.
Yes, sir. So on that, Jay, do you feel comfortable segueing into talking a little bit more about Eros energy?
Sure.
Okay,
yeah,
so
absolutely.
Just for a starting point, so I remember reading C.S. Lewis's The Four Loves, and they talked about how, obviously the English language is not as, it's limited compared to, I think, the Greek. I think those are all Greek. So he talked about agape, obviously. Is it phileo for brotherly love for City of Philadelphia? And then eros. I remember him talking about eros. But the way that you kind of start to talk about eros in your book is really fascinating. So I'd love to hear you as you're talking about exploring deeper parts of desire, what you're working on in your book. Well, however you want to segue that in, I would love to hear kind of what's going on inside of you in the conversation around Eros energy.
Yeah, I'm curious there's a lot of, I don't think anyone has the full understanding of Eros. So sometimes when I hear Eros talked about, it is in that dimension of C.S. Lewis's Four Loves.
Right.
Eros can often be kind of pitted against Thanatos, which is kind of death energy. And so Eros, what I, have really learned a lot from is that it's not just about what you're doing with your genitals. It's not just about, orgasms. It's really this sense of where do you experience a life force? And so when I do a lot of work with men and women, but especially women, there's a sense of they might feel, maybe they came out of purity culture, maybe they've been in a relationship where there's a lot of demand on their life. to be sexually available, and so they feel like they have no erotic energy. They just kind of feel completely shut down.
Okay.
And so part of the work that I try and do with a lot of my clients in intensives is, where do you feel life? Like where it could be like through, maybe you go on a hike, or maybe you're a runner, and when you run, you feel this sense of vitality in your body, or maybe when you cook an amazing meal, there's a sense of kind of like the fragrances that you begin to experience. You make a cocktail and you're like, this last word cocktail with the gin, the lime, the maraschino. There's something about this that's like incredible. And so part of what I would say is that's erotic energy, that sense of like it is against death. It's not this place of shutdown, it's this place of vitality. Okay. And so if we're really understanding erotic energy, it's that sense of like it begins with a sense of life and possibility. And so before, we go into this place of it needs to be genital stimulation or it needs to end in an orgasm, I think it's far more about that issue of like, can we experience pleasure? And pleasure could be related to genitals, it could be related to sex, but it could also be related to like going for a walk with someone that you love. It could be like waking up in the morning, getting outside, having your cup of coffee or tea, and just watching the sunrise. That is all erotic energy that we're working with. And so I think we have to broaden the conversation to kind of just say, where do you feel life? Where do you feel vitality? Where do you feel something of, the goodness and vitality of God working around you and within you?
Okay, so it's life-giving, it's about pleasure, it's creative, it's energizing, it's working the opposite spirit of death. And so I'm just thinking pragmatically for the listeners, I would say the average American is probably in survival mode and very disconnected from that part of their energy. Would you agree with that?
I believe so. Yeah. Yes. Because I think when we're looking at rates of depression, we're looking at rates of anxiety, people are suffering immensely these days.
Yes.
And so that sense of depression is, something of the way of the world is against you, and you feel like literally like your soul is depressed. And then when you're anxious, you don't necessarily feel creative or alive. There's just a sense of, I need to like fend off Thanatos. I need to, fend off financial difficulties. And so there's just a lot of anxiety and depression that begin to undermine some of that erotic energy within us. So, but I think that's what erotic energy is trying to do, is trying to wake us up to another way of living.
Okay. So I'm trying to segue, because again, I told you at the beginning, it's easy for me to geek out, but I want to make it practical for our listeners. So Eros is a blessing. Eros is a good thing. The erotic is actually from God. He designed us for pleasure and sensuality and vitality.
Amen.
And so the unwanted behaviors, do you feel like that works against Eros? Do you feel like that's a mischanneling of Eros? How would you kind of put those together? Or
I do, yeah. So so much of like at least Paul's theology when he talks about sin is like he references that sin is basically against goodness, and so it's against righteousness. It's against. So I would say unwanted sexual behavior is actually not about being too sexual. So in my understanding, you can never become too sexual for God. It's not possible.
Okay, say that one more time. Say that one more time, because that's going to blow people's minds.
It is not possible to become too sexual. So what you can do is you can become far more involved with behaviors that sabotage good and healthy sexuality, which is often what happens. So when people come out of porn, when they come out of blowing up their lives through an affair, they're not like, wow, sex is so beautiful. What they think is like, this is just freaking maddening. And if I could just get rid of this. And so what they're trying to do is trying to eliminate sexuality because they feel like it's too much. And I think we have that completely wrong. So when the theologians talk about sin, they would say in creativity, they would say that, evil cannot create ex nihilo, which
Right.
is just a fancy way of saying out of nothing.
Right.
And so evil cannot create eros. It can't create sexuality. It can't create the splendor of, autumn and the fall and leaves changing colors. Because it can't create. But what it can do is to degrade and to destroy that which God has made good. So the point that C.S. Lewis makes in that is, before spoiled milk can come about, it was originally good milk. And so what evil can do is to steal, to kill, and destroy. So
Right.
what is evil doing with regard to eros? It's trying to destroy it through things like abuse, through pornography, that after you participate in it, you feel like there's something about you that's deeply ashamed, that's unwanted.
Okay.
And so I would say that is all Thanatos energy that's trying to kill off Eros. And so this happened early on in some of my clinical work, but some of the men and women that I would work with, I would kind of make the analogy that they would kind of show me the equivalent of like their backyard. And I'm using this as a metaphor, but they would say, Jay, look at my backyard. There are no weeds anywhere. I am trying to stop unwanted sexual behavior. I've eliminated every sign and hint of lust.
Okay.
And part of what I would say to them is like, yeah, but like your backyard is full of dirt. Like I would never want to
Yeah.
play out here. Like
Yeah.
it's just dead.
Yeah.
And so what they did is they took their gospel version of, Roundup weed spray and just eliminated everything. And so for me, what I'm trying to do with my clients is invite them to create a garden in their backyard of like, what is erotic energy of all kinds of life and vitality and joy and goodness? And how can we create a garden? And are there going to be weeds to pick? Of course, but it's in the service of vitality. It's in the service of flourishing. And so I think that's the invitation to people is don't just try and eliminate kind of bad things and find freedom from something.
Right.
I think that's Galatians 5. It is for freedom that you have been set free. And so what does freedom look like? What does play look like? What does goodness look like? And so instead of just trying to quarantine or manage your sexual life, we should be asking what types of behaviors make me feel pleasurable, make me feel good, that actually connect me to something of, God's desire for my life, which is to feel pleasure, to feel arousal, to feel just the vitality and sensuality across every aspect of my mind and my body. So the body is good, far
Amen.
more than
Amen.
a place of being compromised or just inherently sinful.
You are a true poet, sir. I love that. That's beautiful. That's making me think of, I think it's Homer's The Odyssey with the sirens, the story of the sirens.
Yes.
Is it the Odyssey? When the first ship captain.
I just read that for, I think maybe for the second time, but the first real time.
Did you?
Just
Yeah.
in my own midlife.
Yeah, instead of from
Not
ninth
crisis,
grade English.
but
Yeah.
midlife. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I remember reading
Yeah.
some of it, but it didn't matter.
No, it
But
didn't.
yes,
Not when you're
just-
15. Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
didn't
when
have
he-
enough life, but
yeah,
yes.
I'm not sure many people are familiar with that, but the first ship captain wants to hear the sirens, and he has all of his sailors plug their ears with wax or something so that they won't crash into the rocks. And he is just so they have him tie him to the ship mast, and then he's burning with lust and screaming at the top of his lungs and bursting all the capillaries in his face to let me down to get to the sirens that have been filled him with this lust. And then the second captain is making me think about what you're saying. He plays the sweeter song. He doesn't do all this restrictive, controlling behavior modification. He pulls out his instrument and plays a song that's so beautiful it overpowers the song of the sirens, and then they sail right past the cliffs with no problem. So that's just what's coming to mind as you're sharing. Like, the Lord does have pleasure for us and beauty and sensuality, and it's so much bigger and more colorful than what most of us have been taught. And I think with our culture, like with the porn culture and media and wherever we're at in survival mode, a lot of us have gotten so lazy and myopic or narrow-minded with pleasure and mindfulness and being present with our partners and our bodies that stuff just feels easier and quicker, if that makes sense.
So well said.
So
Yes.
a lot of your work then is teaching people to slow down and being more present and in tune with their bodies and the spiritual and immediacy.
Mhm.
Is that right?
Absolutely. Yep. Very
Cool.
well said.
Cool. Okay, Jay, do you have time to keep talking, sir? I know we started a little late, but I want to respect your schedule.
Sure.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, so can we talk a little bit about, again, we could talk for 26 hours about all the content, so I'm going to keep promoting your book. Y'all, you
think
need to
we
go
could.
check out his book, Unwanted, because it's so rich. You talked, let's see. Can we talk about the 6 core life experiences that set people up? I have
Sure.
them. Yeah, I'm happy to list them off and if you want me to, but the 6 core life experiences that kind of set people up for wiring us towards unwanted sexual behavior. I'd love, because I think a lot of the listeners are going to resonate with that and go, oh my gosh, yeah, that's totally my experience. No wonder I'm doing this or I'm seeking that.
Yeah, I think I can remember all 6, but I might have you list them just in case.
Yeah. Okay, so you have deprivation. So 6 core life experiences that humans can experience that set us up for vulnerability, if you will, towards. You have deprivation, dissociation, unconscious arousal, futility, lust, and anger.
Yes.
So I know I see a ton of that in my practice. So I'd love to hear your wisdom around that.
Yeah, so when I, started paying attention to clients, part of that first question in Unwanted is, how did I get here? And that's where I went into a lot of the family of origin, adverse childhood experiences, kind of like, what are the trauma stories? But then, the second question that Unwanted asks is, why do I stay in here? So how did I get here? Why do I stay? And then eventually... how do I get out? And everybody picks up the book because they want to get to that third question.
Right.
But in my estimation, you have to honor the first 2 questions if you're going to get out. If you try and get out without examining. So part 2 really looks at what are the, themes and dynamics that keep us in this particular place. So if we look at that first one of deprivation, imagine like a seesaw between deprivation on one end and entitlement on the other end. And so part of what I started recognizing with my clients is, although it looked like they were deeply entitled people, part of what I observed is that they lived with a lot of deprivation in their life. They didn't feel like they deserved time to themselves. They didn't feel like they could spend money on themselves. Or maybe they, it felt like they hadn't been to the doctor in a very long time, or felt like no one really loved them. They felt very lonely in life. And so most of that sense is they felt this chronic sense of deprivation in their relational life, in their kind of personal life. And then what ends up happening is the seesaw goes back to a place of entitlement where, I've been so good. I've been trying to kind of stay connected to my family, or I've been a really good person. And then eventually I feel entitled to this thing.
Okay.
I know whenever I travel and I go, this used to happen more when I would travel, I would be in like deprivation mode of like, I want to make sure I'm eating right and healthy. I'll get on the airplane, and if I get upgraded, I'm going to say no to a drink because I want to stay good and connected and in my body.
Right.
And then after the conference is over, after the workshop is over, I get to the lounge or I get on the plane, and I'm like, I've been so good. I deserve this cookie, this brownie, which are all good things. But it goes from this place of deprivation into entitlement. And so that would be a core dimension. Dissociation is just a sense of when trauma happens to us, trauma fragments reality. And so we don't really feel connected to ourselves. We don't feel connected to our bodies. And so usually, trauma comes from the Greek word meaning wound. And so wounds are painful, and it's not possible for us to stay in places of relational pain in our own trauma. And so we look to things to begin to numb and to kind of dissociate from some of the painful realities of our life. So that could be loneliness, that could be a marriage that is either tepid or emotionally violent or entitled. And so that sense of, I don't want to be in this, I need to kind of dissociate from reality. And, we talked about unconscious arousal. I don't know how in depth you want to go into these things. But then we
You're
have
doing great.
unconscious
You're doing great.
arousal, and then futility is just that sense of, the curse for a man in Genesis 3 is basically thorns and thistles. So eventually everything that a man does returns to dust. It's a sense of like, I can try and write a really good book,
Right.
but eventually someone's going to write a better book. I can invest all this time and energy into my kids, and then they walk away from faith. I can invest all this time and energy into my marriage, but then my partner cheats on me, or they don't want to have anything to do with me. And so in that sense of futility, we will often go to an unwanted sexual behavior because we feel powerful again. We don't have to feel futility. And then anger is also a vital component to this as well, because it's not just a lust issue. And I think that's what the church has kind of done a disservice to us, is I do think lust is part of it.
Right.
But I think we've also left out anger. And so, for a lot of my clients, they might describe, I wanted more out of my husband, or I wanted more out of my wife, and they didn't want to give it to me. So on the next business trip, I found a woman that was far more engaging, that read me, that liked me, enjoyed me. And so it looks like lust, but there's also a backdrop of anger of like, you loser, you neglected
Contempt,
me.
resentment.
What's wrong with you?
Absolutely.
I'm going to find what I want. So anger can all be part of that as well. And we've covered lust here and there, but oftentimes what happens is if you want to outgrow an unwanted sexual behavior, not just quit it, but outgrow it, you have to address all 6 of those as tributaries. So imagine those, outgrowing porn is like the river, like the Mississippi River. Most people just try to stop the tributary of lust, and then they think that they've done all the work that they need to do because they got internet monitoring, they're praying about it, but you haven't addressed your deprivation.
That's right.
You haven't addressed the anger in your life. You haven't addressed dissociation and trauma history. And so, of course, that thing is not going to be effective because there's so many other tributaries. And so that part of my book is really inviting people to look at, how are portions of my life and strategies in my life kind of setting me up for these recurring patterns.
Thank you. So Jay, I'm curious, this is maybe a selfish question, but I see this a lot in my work with men. Have you, in your research, because you're an awesome researcher, you've done beautiful research with guys in this area, and in your book, y'all need to listen to this or read it because he talks a lot about that research. What's been your experience between lust and anger? And the reason I'm asking is, from a testosterone perspective or anger, I know sometimes people get into full-blown fight or flight, like sympathetic nervous system arousal. And I've had like soldiers I've worked with that have talked about having like full-blown erections in the middle of a gunfight. So I'm curious, I've been curious just selfishly as a sex therapist over the years, and nobody's been able to answer this. Like, what's the connection between lust and anger? Is it self-soothing? Is it testosterone? What have you seen in your work, if I can ask?
Yeah, so I think that, again, just that sense of the tributaries, there is so much going on in that. So part of where I would kind of begin is that, like, when you come from a place of trauma is that sense of fragmentation, that, if your dad dies, your parents get divorced, you've been bullied at school, you don't feel like you have solid ground underneath your feet.
Okay.
And so one of the ways that sex can work for us is that, if we begin to feel some level of anger or some level of entitlement, anger will provide a sense of solid ground underneath our feet. So that sense of like, I might feel dissociated, I might feel traumatized and fragmented, but when I start feeling angry and powerful, I feel like I have a very solid sense of self. And so eventually what can begin to happen is I want to feel adrenaline, noradrenaline, catecholamines pulsing through my system, because that's so much better than to feel out of control or ashamed. So for a lot of guys that I work with, that is part of the experience that they have. Other times it can be a sense of if they, grew up and they maybe had an abuser or someone that kind of humiliated them. part of what they're trying to do is to kind of reenact some of that story, but also reverse some of that experience. So when you're looking at, a lot of porn begins to move into themes of degradation and humiliation. That's not just lust. It's a sense of, I need to make someone small.
Yeah.
And why do I need to make someone small? Because that's part of the human heart, but it's also because I have been made small and I hated it. And so I begin to feel powerful when I humiliate other people around me. And so, there is David Schnarch, sex therapist, marriage expert. He passed away, but one of his phrases that he used quite a bit was that he referred to it as normal marital sadism. I think Terry Real refers to it as normal marital hatred. I think he's taking it some from Schnarch, but it's that sense of, we all do things to one another to make people angry, to feel powerful, to kind of make moves.
Yeah.
And so I think integrity is not just like I'm lusting after someone, but it's also a sense of like, I want to make you pay. And so one of my mentors and friends is a guy named Dan Allender, and he always talks about Matthew 5 and just that notion of Jesus defines sin as an issue of lust and anger. So we're all adulterers and we're all murderers, which we don't really like. So that sense of lust is this, he would say it is a desire gone mad. So I desire connection. I desire goodness. I want to be pursued emotionally, sexually. And that becomes a desire that's gone mad of, you're not pursuing me. You're not wanting me in the way that I want to be wanted. So then it moves into a heart of anger and really a heart of murder of, I know what's precious to you, this image that you've created, some sense of this, and I'm going to do something to deliberately blow this up in our marriage or in our life. And so that's really that sense of like, we can do things to one another that are not kind, that are actually deeply committed to doing degradation, humiliation, violence. And most of us don't like to use those words. It's just, no, I felt lonely or I felt neglected. And it's not that that's untrue. It's just a partial truth. It's like you did feel neglected, but you also wanted to make someone pay. And so I think if we're really going to outgrow unwanted behaviors and actually learn how to be kind to our partners, we have to say, I do have a heart that lusts, that has a desire gone mad, but also when you don't fulfill the idols that I have set up for you to fulfill, I will kill you. And that's what James 4 says is, what causes fights and quarrels among you.
That's right.
You want something and you don't get it, so you kill. And I know I'm using hyperbolic language here,
but
it's that sense of, we don't want, when people disappoint us, we are mean to them. I need to look no further to my own marriage and my own kids to know that, like, I'm a man that's full of lust, and it's not just sexual lust. It's a lust for our home to be ordered in a particular way, for my kids to, stay contained at dinner without kind of bursting into this raw desire of childhood. And so my desire to have a good conversation at dinner is beautiful, but it can also become a demand of, if you act out, if you disrupt this family, I will make you pay with a glare, with a look. And so that is, just the interplay between lust and anger is happening everywhere, not just in our sexual life, but it's happening in our work life. It's happening in our relational life of all kinds.
So well said, Pastor. I love that. That's so good. Okay, so Jay, selfishly, because we have to wrap up here, when does your next book come out, sir?
It will be released in March of 2026.
Okay, so next March.
Next March.
Yeah,
and I'm so excited for it.
That's awesome. If people want to find you, reach out to you, if fellow therapists are interested in, I'm going to share all of your contact information in the podcast and on my websites, etc. But where can people find you if they're interested in getting in touch with you?
My website is jay-stringer.com.
Okay.
And so the dash is in there because there's also another Jay Stringer that's an author. He's a British crime fiction novelist or something.
Okay.
And so sometimes people will be like, I read Unwanted and then I read your next book, and it was kind of a departure of genre.
That's funny.
So jay-stringer.com.
Okay.
And then on Instagram, I think it's JAY_Stringer_.
Okay.
And again, other Jay Stringers beat me to Instagram. But on the website, there is information on intensives. If you are a man or woman trying to understand your sexual story, compulsive behavior, betrayal trauma, there's also a professional training tab. So if you are a therapist, a pastor, a coach, that really wants to do a lot better work with your clients, and you want to understand your own sexual desires, your own family of origin, we offer those trainings twice a year, just to do a deep dive into your story to help you be a better clinician or coach. And then Instagram kind of has more of the, psychoeducation. I'm not nearly as active as I should be, but hopefully in the next year I'll be
that just means
more
you're very
engaged there.
You're very busy and you have boots on the ground.
I don't like social media.
I know.
So.
I understand. It's kind of helpful for business, but that's about it. So Jay, I literally cannot say thank you enough. Like, it is truly an absolute privilege and dream that you were willing to come on the show today. And my words are not even going to do justice, my internal gratitude for you and your work. So thank you for your years of research and prayer and dedication and following the Spirit's leading in pioneer work. That's like literally setting people free with the gospel and grace and deep identity formation. Like, it's literally so inspiring for me as a practitioner and just as a sister in the Lord. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart for being willing to come on. And again, the Lord bless you and your work and where you're going next. So thank you so much.
Thank you for those kind words, Carissa. I received them, and also thank you. It's been such a great conversation, and I'm so encouraged by, your podcast, your PhD work, to be able to really bridge like what is healthy sexuality, what is honoring science and research and faith. And so may there be more people like you as well. So thank you for your labor.
You're welcome.
In this area.
In Jesus' name, amen. Thank you.
Amen. Yes.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the Healthy Sex Podcast, hosted by Carissa Kay. If you're an Apple user, please leave us a review. And no matter where you're listening to the podcast at, please feel free to share it with your friends. You can find all of our conversations at thehealthysexpodcast.com.